If you're not a biology student, this video is not for you. Go back and check out physical science. For now, biology students, we have moved on to Chapter 7, Cellular Structure and Function. There are also 4 sections. Section 1, Cell Discovery and Theory. Section 2, the Plasma Membrane. Section 3, Structures and Organelles. And Section 4, Cellular Transport. The big idea, cells are structural and functional units of all living organisms. And as always, you do not need this KWL. Main idea of each section, starting with Section 1, the invention of the microscope led to the discovery of cells. Section 2, the plasma membrane helps to maintain a cell's homeostasis. Section 3, eukaryotic cells contain organelles that allow the specializations and the separation of functions within the cell. And Section 4, cellular transport moves substances within the cell and moves substances into and out of the cell. So that brings us straight to Section 1, Cell Discovery and History. So history of the cell theory. One of the new things that you're going to do for the rest of the year, starting with this chapter, is at the beginning of each new heading on the slide, you need to add the textbook page where you can find this heading at. I will be grading that. So a cell is the basic structural and functional unit of all living organisms. Cells are so small that their existence was unknown before the invention of microscopes. The cell theory is one of the fundamental ideas of modern biology and includes the following 3 principles. And ladies and gentlemen, not only do you need to know the cell theory definition, you need to know also the 3 principles. 1. All living organisms are composed of 1 or more cells. 2. Cells are the basic unit of structure and organization of all living organisms. 3. Cells arise only from previously existing cells, with cells passing copies of their genetic material on to their daughter cells. So let's dive a little bit further into microscope technology. Make sure after you write microscope technology, you're writing also the textbook's page number. Compound light microscopes. They use a series of glass lenses and visible light to magnify images. And magnify images up to 1,000 times that's actual size. Electron microscopes are a little different. They create an image by illuminating a sample with a beam of electrons and collecting the electrons that are reflected back from the sample. So this can have magnify images up to 500,000 times the actual size. So there's some basic cell types. Once you write this down, please put the textbook page number. You'll be copying everything from here. All cells have at least one physical trait in common, a plasma membrane. It's a special boundary that helps control what enters and leaves the cell. Kind of think of a guard. You know, he's the one at a prison that says, yes, you can come in, and no, I don't have time for it. You need to stay out there. Most cells contain genetic material in some form, and they break down molecules to generate energy. There's 2 basic kinds of cells that you will be tested on, eukaryotic and prokaryotic. Eukaryotic cells contain a nucleus and other organelles inside of it. What are organelles? Well, they're specialized structures that perform specific cell functions. The nucleus is the distinct central organelle that contains the cell's genetic material. Eukaryotic cells are generally much larger than prokaryotic cells simply because they hold a lot more stuff. So if I just jump back just for a second about organelles, and it says they perform specific cell functions, and one of those organelles is a nucleus. Well, if we were talking about a city, what inside the city controls everything about the city? City Hall, right? The mayor. So that's another way to look at it. Prokaryotic cells are cells without a nucleus or other membrane-bound organelles. They're smaller and simpler than eukaryotes, and they're probably similar to the first organisms that lived on Earth. If you'd like to, go to your online textbook and check out the Brain Pop video on cell specialization. So basic cell type still. Origin of cell diversity. First bullet point, eukaryotic cells may have evolved from prokaryotic cells. We don't know for sure. This isn't a law, but it is something that we strongly believe in. The endosymbiont theory proposes that a symbiotic relationship formed between two prokaryotic cells, one of which lived inside of the other. Eventually, the symbiotic relationship led to the two cells becoming one. Because eukaryotic cells are larger and more complex, they've developed special functions, and these special functions led to cell diversity and thus organismal diversity. This is a good time to tell you the amoeba sisters, AMOEBA sisters. They have little 5-7 minute clip videos. They're cartoonish, but they were developed by women that when they first started doing these, they were only like 18, 19 years old. So they're pretty close in your age, and they just have a way of making something that's tremendously boring to most people kind of interesting. Okay, so it has a little bit of SpongeBob type music in the background. So if you can get over that part, I think you'll really enjoy and learn a lot from this.
Today we're going to talk about the two different types of cells. This is a very important biology objective, but it's also really important in daily life. So let me give you an example. Let's say you get a really bad infection. And there's a lot of things that can cause infections, right? For example, bacteria can cause infections, and viruses can cause infections. But the kind of infection I'm talking about today, it's a fungus infection. Fungi, and that's the plural of fungus. You don't say funguses, you say fungi. Fungi can cause all kinds of infections. For example, ringworm. That's not a worm at all, despite the name. It's actually a fungus. Or athlete's foot. That's a fungus. Or yeast infection. Okay, I'm probably really grossing you out, but this is all type of fungus infection. But the kind of fungus infection I'm going to talk about is one that's more rare. It's one that would happen if, for example, you were in the hospital and your immune system was really compromised. This is not a common thing at all, but it is a possible thing. Fungi can get into the bloodstream. And if it does, it is extremely difficult to treat. Why? Well, for one thing, antibiotics do not work on fungi. Antibiotics only work on bacteria. Bacteria are an example of prokaryote cells. So fungi, it's not a type of prokaryote. It's actually the other type of cell called eukaryotes. And antibiotics are not effective against eukaryotes. Your own cells are also eukaryotes. So when you try to treat the fungus that's in the blood, it's extremely difficult to treat because you might hurt your own cells or at least have some really undesirable side effects. So the example here talked about two different kinds of cells, prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Prokaryotes were the bacteria. Eukaryotes, however, in our example included the fungi cells and also the human cells. Now, these two different cell types have one major thing in common. They both have a cell membrane. All living cells have cell membranes. We have a longer clip on how important the cell membrane is. It controls what goes in and out of the cell, and by doing that, it keeps everything pretty stable. Don't get the cell membrane, though, mixed up with a cell wall, which offers support and protection. That varies in the groups, so that's not an always thing. But cell membrane, yes, always. Also, both prokaryotes and eukaryotes have genetic material in the form of DNA. They both have this, otherwise, whenever you make more of that type of cell, there would be no way to transmit the genetic information. Prokaryotes and eukaryotes both have ribosomes, which are these tiny little structures that help make protein for the cell. We actually get to this fascinating process a little bit later. Now, one major difference, though, between prokaryotes and eukaryotes is that eukaryotes have something called membrane-bound organelles. I like to think of the word organelle like the word organ. Okay, like you know how you have organs in your body? You have a heart, you have liver, you have lungs. Well, organelle, I like to think of that as kind of like little organs. And eukaryotes have these membrane-bound organelles. There's a whole list of them, and if you look online, you can find a bunch of them and their functions for the cells, but prokaryotes do not have membrane-bound organelles. So one way I like to tell students to remember this, eukaryote, the U rhymes with do, they do have membrane-bound organelles, and prokaryote, the pro rhymes with no, and they do not have membrane-bound organelles. So what is an example of a membrane-bound organelle? A very famous one is the nucleus. And I say it's famous because everyone always thinks of this one. It's kind of like the brain of the cell. It controls a lot of the cell's functions. And it also holds the genetic material for eukaryotes. So the nucleus holds the DNA. Prokaryotes, again, do not have a membrane-bound organelle, so they do not have a nucleus. And so their DNA is organized in a different manner, and it's not as nicely organized either as it is in a eukaryote. We're not going to go into the different types of organelles today. That's pretty easy information to find. One thing, though, that I'd like to mention, if a cell has a certain function, it might have more of a certain kind of organelle, or it might have a different kind of an organelle than another cell. So let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Plant cells, for example, it's a type of eukaryote. Okay, plant cells, they make sugar from the sun. They have an organelle called a chloroplast that animal cells don't have because animal cells cannot make sugar from the sun. Or say we're talking about muscle cells in your body. They need a lot of energy in order to do their function. So actually muscle cells have a lot of a type of organelle called mitochondria than some of your other human cells because they have to produce so much energy. So the types of organelles and the quantity of them can vary slightly because you've got these different cell functions. Well, that's it for the Amoeba Sisters, and we remind you to stay curious.
Okay, so now that you've watched that, I'm going to suggest that you watch it maybe a couple more times. 2 reasons. 1, you will be getting a quiz over section 1. In fact, you'll get a quiz over all the sections. And secondly, you will have a worksheet over this, prokaryotes and eukaryotes, that you will be working on in class. So I don't know yet if I'm going to give it as a quiz. So just in case, I'd watch this a couple more times.